And I am not an intellectual property expert, so let me preface that. But I do think, especially as sort of, and maybe it's helpful to look at this through a sort of almost like a case study perspective. But that as, for example, as data sharing becomes more and more required and more the norm, licensing, which is a component that drives interoperability, becomes more and more important. So if we are, for example, if a journal, for example, has a editorial policy which requires authors to share the data underlying their manuscripts, if there aren't guidelines and requirements for how that data can be reused by others, so licensing and reuse language, then when we sort of look farther down the pipeline and think about one research lab wanting to reuse that data, or in an even more complicated way, a research team wanting to reuse data from multiple repositories or from one repository with multiple contributors. If there are conflicting licensing attached to those data sets, or licensing is unclear, or there are reuse guidelines and restrictions that inhibit reuse without sort of having to ask permission, then we aren't realizing what the open data was intended to provide. So licensing is an important component of really driving the benefits of open science. For example, my boss here at OHSU, and I think I mentioned that my position lives actually in a scientific lab within the library. And my boss leads a project called the Monarch Initiative, which is driven by hundreds of different data sets. So they're mining and using ontologies to relate and query against hundreds of different data sets. And while that project is immensely complicated, one of the biggest hurdles that they've encountered is not necessarily finding or accessing the data to drive their work, but navigating the licensing and reuse restrictions attached to those individual data sets. So in that sense, I think that intellectual property in terms of really getting data producers and repository managers in tune with the licensing components and the language that facilitates the kind of reuse and interoperability that is intended is as important as sharing the data itself.